Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to review the Constitution unit. And we'll start off with the Supremacy Clause, the question we just had. So what is the Supremacy Clause?
If like the national government and the states or whatever get into a little bit of a tussle or whatever, the national government always wins.
Right. If there's a conflict between a state law and the national law law always wins. So the national law is supreme over the state laws. Now remember, in federalism there is a distinct difference in the powers of state and national government. That's a separate issue. Federalism is a separate issue. This is when we're talking about a conflict between a state law and a national law. An example of this would be, say, minimum wage laws. States can make higher minimum wage laws than the national law, but they cannot make a lower minimum wage law. So like Florida, the minimum wage is, $12-ish an hour, but with the national law, it's like 7 something an hour. The national law always wins. Because it's a minimum wage, states can go higher, they just can't go below that. So supremacy law, or the Supremacy Clause, says when there's a conflict between national law and state law, the national law wins. So that means the national law is supreme. And what is the supreme law of the nation? The Constitution. So all laws in the nation have to fall under the Constitution, within the Constitution, which is why we have judicial review and Supreme Court and all that sort of stuff. The Constitution is the law of the land, the supreme law. That's an important thing to remember for that test at the end of the year. The Constitution is the supreme law. But Supremacy Clause in the Constitution says that national laws trump state laws. Okay, what is another clause that you need to know for this unit?
Commerce.
Well, both of those. We'll look at Commerce Clause and Elastic Clause.
Isn't that federalism though?
Well, we talked about it in federalism, but it's part of the Constitution, so it's repeated here. So the Commerce Clause, same root as commercial, like businesses, trade. So the Commerce Clause is about trade. It says that the Congress can regulate trade that crosses state borders or national borders. According to the Constitution, as it was initially understood in the first 150 years, Congress could not regulate trade within a state. It could only regulate trade that crossed state borders or national borders or the border into a Native American reservation. That's changed a little bit. We'll get to that later on. There's a much broader interpretation, but the Commerce Clause is still there. It still says that Congress can only regulate trade crossing state borders. Okay? And that's the Commerce Clause. The Elastic Clause is also known, aka, also known as what? The Necessary and Proper Clause. Necessary and Proper Clause. Okay? This says that Congress can do things that are needed, necessary and proper, to carry out its functions. Now there are two types of functions in Congress. One are called enumerated powers. Spell that wrong. Enumerated powers. And the other are implied powers. And this is not just for Congress, it's for President, judicial. Okay, the enumerated powers. The root word there is numer, which is like numeral. What's a numeral?
A number.
A number. So these are like numbered powers. Think of it as numbered, like 1, 2, 3, which is listed. When you number something, you're listing it. So these are the listed powers. These are the things that the Constitution specifically says the President can do, or the Congress can do. These are powers that are numbered or listed in the Constitution. One of the listed powers of Congress is to declare war. Okay? That's an enumerated power. It is implied by that if they're going to declare war, they must be able to form an army. Okay? That's not numbered or listed, but it's implied. Because remember with the Articles of Confederation, the problem was they could declare war, but they couldn't form an army. So that was useless. So it's implied, if they can declare war, they must be able to form an army. So these are implied powers versus enumerated powers. The necessary and proper clause or elastic clause deals with implied powers. These are things that are not directly stated in the Constitution, but the Constitution does say Congress can do anything necessary and proper to perform its duties. And one of its duties is declaring war. So it's necessary and proper, or implied, that they can form an army. So implied powers go with the elastic clause, necessary and proper clause. It's called the elastic clause. Like the Constitution actually says necessary and proper. It's sometimes called the elastic clause because it gives the Congress, the president, some ability to stretch their powers within a certain boundary. Okay? So elastic, necessary and proper, same thing, deal with implied powers. Okay, what else do you guys want to know about with the Constitution?
Literally anything that's going to be on the test or it's actually like needed to know.
Okay, anything on the test. How about Articles 1, 2, and 3? What is Article 1 of the Constitution about?
The right to bear arms.
That's Amendment 2.
Freedom of speech.
So,
They can worship any religion they want.
let me clarify. This has come up in each class. A lot of people are confusing Article 1 with Amendment 1. The amendments are the changes, the things that are added to the Constitution. The articles are the original part of the Constitution, and they're organized into groups based on what they are talking about. Article 1 is talking about the legislative branch. Article 2 is talking about the executive branch. And Article 3 is judicial. Okay. If you ever read the Constitution, it's kind of a boring document. It's not meant to be exciting. All it does is say, here's how the government's going to be organized. Here's how we're going to elect representatives. Here's how we're going to decide who gets to be a senator. Here's the powers of the Senate. It just organizes, it constitutes, that's why it's called the Constitution, it constitutes or forms the basis of the government. It was not meant to be an exciting document. It is meant to be a legal document so that when there's an argument about what government can do, we have a Constitution to go back and look and say, okay, it's like a contract. It says this. Contracts are not exciting documents. Laws are not exciting documents. It's not meant to be exciting. So Article 1 forms or organizes, gives the rules for the legislature. Why do you think they started with the legislature as Article 1? It's the strongest, most powerful branch. They start right off the bat with it. So what it does is it tells us the legislature exists. The legislature is going to be formed of two houses. The two houses are the House and the Senate. It goes through and explains that representatives in the House of Representatives are elected for 2 years. They have to be 25 years old. You know, it goes through all that sort of stuff. It says the Senate is elected for 6 years. They have to be 30 years old. It just outlines what the legislature is and will do. Article 2 is about the executive, the president. It outlines who the president is, how long the president's going to serve for, how the president gets elected, all of that kind of stuff. That's Article 2 because that was considered the second most powerful. And then Article 3 is the judicial. That's the third. They thought that was the weakest. In the last several decades, the judicial has become more and more powerful, more and more important. But originally, it was considered to be the weakest. After that, you have some more articles. You don't really need to know the specifics of those articles. They get into how the Constitution was going to be ratified, first approved. It gets into the amendment process and how we can change the Constitution. That's all in there. But what you do need to know is Articles 1, 2, and 3, legislative, executive, judicial. Then, amendments. So these are articles, amendments. That's when we get into the Bill of Rights. The first, how many amendments? First 10 amendments. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about the amendments to the Constitution. The ones you need to know about at this point are the First Amendment,
Second Amendment.
Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, and 10th Amendment.
That's it.
That's all you need to know at this point. And we'll get to the others later on more, but right now, for this test, first, fourth, fifth, and 10th.
I only know two. The second.
Yeah.
Well, you're going to learn more.
Alright.
Okay, what is the First Amendment?
The right to bear arms.
That's the Second Amendment.
Freedom of speech.
What?
Freedom of speech.
I thought the first one was you could
Religion.
worship.
Freedom of press.
Yeah, religion.
Add a symbol. Just add the second one on.
So only
Done.
6, 7, 8, or 9.
Okay, so you guys have said speech, religion, press. What else?
Fact check.
Define press.
We'll get to
Like
that.
news.
Right now, I just want to list them. So another one is petition.
Protest.
Right.
Some girl Greta reminds me of
Riot.
George
Greta
Bush.
Thunberg.
An assembly. Okay, so now, what do each of these mean? So, speech, pretty straightforward. You have the right to free speech. You can say your opinions, you can talk, you can do things. Now, of course, the Supreme Court over time has added restrictions to that, like you can't yell fire in a theater, things like that.
What about
So,
school?
speech. School,
Fire.
you do have freedom of speech. One of the Supreme Court cases you're going to have to learn about is the Tinker v. Des Moines case.
I know about that.
And in the Tinker v. Des Moines case, there were some students in high school during the Vietnam War, and they put black armbands on in order to protest the Vietnam War. They got suspended, and the Supreme Court ruled that they were allowed to protest the Vietnam War so they could wear their black armbands. There was another case where a student held up a sign that said "Bong hits for Jesus," and the Supreme Court ruled that the student couldn't do that because the schools had a legitimate interest in discouraging drug use among students. So,
For cheese?
as students, you do have some free speech rights, but they are a little more limited than in the general public. But you do not completely lose your free speech rights as a student. Freedom of religion says that you can practice any religion you want or no religion, which is also important there. This is sometimes called the Free Exercise Clause.
Are we going to have to name it the Free Exercise Clause like in the test?
I might ask you what clause is freedom of religion. Okay, Free Exercise Clause. Exercise doesn't mean to work out, it means to practice. So it means you have the freedom to practice your religion. This is actually really important because today, sometimes people will make the argument that freedom of religion doesn't really matter because religion can't be threatened anyway by government because religion is a belief. And how can the government cause you to believe something or not believe something? So they'll argue that there really is no way to oppress or take away your freedom of religion because you can always believe whatever you want. But the Constitution doesn't just give you the right to believe, it gives you the right to practice your belief. Okay? So that means if the government says you can't go to church, that doesn't stop you from being a Christian, but it does stop you from practicing an aspect of being a Christian. So the government can't do that. That's why free exercise is actually important. It's not just freedom of religion to believe something, it's to do what your religion tells you to do. Now again, just like speech, there are exceptions. If your religion includes like child sacrifice or something like that, you know, like some religions have human sacrifice and stuff. You can't do that. Okay, so there's some restrictions. Freedom of press. Freedom of press is like speech, but it's written materials. You have the ability to write things, to write a book or something like that. Okay. Freedom of petition is asking the government, protesting, asking the government to change something. It's the freedom to petition for the redress of grievances, or redress is addressing, solving problems. So you can complain about the government. Freedom of assembly is the right to gather with other people to form groups. So these are the 5 specified, enumerated rights in the Bill of Rights. there's actually a sixth right that's hidden in the First Amendment. There's something called a penumbra. This is a word you will not see very often, but maybe in earth science, you might have heard of it. Penumbra means shadow. So in earth science, when you study the phases of the moon, a crescent moon means you can see what about the moon?
Half the moon. No,
You-
crescent of the moon.
You can see a little sliver of the moon, a crescent. The part you cannot see that is in a shadow is called the penumbra. Okay? In this case, in legal terminology, penumbra is something that isn't obvious, but it's hidden. And the Supreme Court has ruled that there's a hidden right in the First Amendment. That's a right to privacy. Now, why does this matter? So, in all of these rights, for example, the Supreme Court has ruled you have the right to be anonymous. You can write whatever you want, but you do not also have to put your name on it. So you can write under a fake name. Okay? That's important because let's suppose you wanted to write something critical of the government. And let's say you had the right to do that, but the government required everything published had to have your real name on it. Would that make some people a little less likely to criticize the government?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. What if the government said, yeah, you have the right to practice your religion, but we're going to make a list of everybody's religion and put it on the internet? Would that make some people not want to identify with certain religions? Yeah, okay. So the Supreme Court has ruled in order to truly practice these things, you must have the right to do them in privacy. You can be anonymous. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the Fourth and Fifth Amendments. The Fourth Amendment is about search and seizure. The government cannot search your property without a, what do they need? Warrant. In order to get a warrant, the police would have to go to a judge and say, we believe that this person is committing this crime and we want to search their property, their house or whatever, for this evidence that we believe they have. The judge would look at what evidence they have to believe this and decide, do they deserve a warrant or not? If the judge thinks, yeah, you have a good reason to think this, they'll give the warrant, then the police will show up at your house and say, we have a warrant. So if you watch any of those law shows, people always show up with their warrant. The police come in and say, we have a warrant, okay? This has changed a little bit in the last 120-ish years because of automobiles.
Oh.
Technology tends to change how we understand these rights. So automobiles changed it because let's suppose during the time of Prohibition, when selling or making alcohol was illegal, if they thought you were running an illegal distillery, producing alcohol at your house, they could go and get a warrant and come back and search your house. But if they suspected you of using your car to smuggle alcohol across state lines, if they went and got a warrant, what would happen when they came back?
You'd be gone.
You'd be gone. So police started going to the Supreme Court and saying, we don't have time to get a warrant if somebody is using their car to commit a crime. And eventually the Supreme Court said, okay, yeah, the warrant thing isn't always necessary. So they created this doctrine called probable cause, which is if the police have good reason to believe you're committing a crime, they can search you without a warrant. Once they do, if they search you and they find something illegal, then they have to tell a judge afterwards why they had probable cause and justify using that evidence. If the judge says, no, you didn't really have a good reason, you just got lucky and the person did have drugs or alcohol or whatever, then the evidence would be thrown out and they couldn't use it in court against you. But they still have to justify it, they just get to justify it after the fact. So, if police stop you while you're driving, they can't just search your car.
So just keep going.
Don't keep going. They can stop you. But how many of you have ever seen, like, maybe you've seen it in person, or maybe on like a TV show like Cops or something like that, the police stop someone and they say something like, you don't mind if we search your car, right? You don't mind if we take a look around. If they ask you, can we look around,
Say no.
Well, it means they don't have probable cause. They're asking for permission.
No means no.
And you can say no.
Yeah.
Okay? So you can say no. Now, sometimes people think, well, they're going to search my car anyway. Well, no, not unless they have probable cause. And if they had probable cause, they wouldn't have asked you. They would have just told you they're going to search your car. What could be probable cause? One is they're coming up talking to you and they look and you've got a big stash of drugs on your seat there. Okay? They have probable cause. Maybe they have a drug sniffing dog and the dog's going crazy around your car or whatever. That would be probable cause. Okay? But generally, if they ask, they don't have probable cause. So that's Fourth Amendment, search and seizure. They can't take your property, they can't search your property without a warrant, except there's been some exceptions for like automobiles and stuff like that. Okay, Fifth Amendment. Fifth Amendment. People talk about, I plead the Fifth.
Oh yeah. The right to
Pleading
speak.
guilty.
Right.
Like you don't have to speak if you don't want to speak.
The Fifth Amendment says you do not have to provide evidence of your own guilt. So, if you're called to court, they accuse you of a crime, they cannot make you testify against yourself. Pleading the Fifth means you're not speaking, you're not being called as a witness. They can call other witnesses against you, but they can't force you to be a witness against yourself. Now that's in court. In normal everyday life, if you've ever heard somebody read their Miranda rights on TV, hopefully, not in person, but if you've heard it on TV, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. They're telling you, you have the right to not give evidence. So, if a cop comes up to you and says, what did you just shove in your pocket? You can say, am I suspected of a crime? And they'll say yes or no, and explain if they have probable cause. If they say, well, no, I didn't accuse you of a crime, you just say, okay, then can I go? And the cop will be like, yeah, I guess so. Or they'll say, no, I think you stashed drugs in your pocket, and then go through the whole probable cause
And you
thing.
throw 'em away.
But you do not have to explain what you put in your pocket. You don't have to provide evidence of your own guilt. Okay? So this is why in court dramas, legal dramas, those TV shows, people will say like, I want to talk to my lawyer. I'm not saying anything until I talk to my lawyer. So you do not have to testify against yourself. That's the Fifth. These two, Fourth and Fifth, are really big protections for people in our legal system. They can't search you without probable cause or a warrant, and they can't force you to talk if you don't want to. Any questions on the Fourth and Fifth Amendments? Okay. 10th Amendment. 10th Amendment limits the federal government. It says that the federal or national government can only do what the Constitution says it can do. If it's not in the Constitution, then it's reserved for the people or the states. Originally, the national government was supposed to be relatively small and very limited. This again has changed a lot under a certain type of federalism. What was that federalism that expanded the power of the national government a lot?
Wait, what was the question?
Which type of federalism expanded the national government's role a lot? Cooperative federalism. Okay, but originally, the national government was really limited, and that's the 10th Amendment. One of the things to remember is that when the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were arguing, one of the complaints the Anti-Federalists had was that the rights of people were not listed in the Constitution. The Federalists, like James Madison, argued they didn't want to list people's rights because if they did, then future governments could say, well, you don't have any rights that aren't listed in here. You only have these rights. The Anti-Federalists said, no, if we don't list their rights in the future, the government might say you have no rights because the Constitution doesn't give you any rights. So they compromised and came up with the Bill of Rights, which says you have these rights, but then at the very end, it says these are not your only rights. You have other rights. The national government is limited to just what the federal government says, but the people are not limited in their rights. So that was the compromise, was making a Bill of Rights, but including that 10th Amendment, so that you do have listed rights, but these are not all your rights.